From Cherry Hill Publishing. Nameless by Joe Conlan. Read by Tracy Thibodeux. "1,400 miles north, while Nikki was taking in her last breaths, a winter storm was raging through Otisville, New York, home to one of the state's federal correctional facilities. Former FBI agent Daniel Falcone pulled the meager, jail-issued blanket tightly over his head, hoping beyond hope to achieve mindless sleep. It might as well have been a 3-inch thick, electronically heated comforter. It wasn't going to make a lick of difference. His failure to find warmth or sleep was the result of much more than the frigid weather. The relentless, nagging thoughts racing through his head were the real culprits. An unyielding, judgmental introspection brutally tormented his peace of mind and sense of well-being. Daniel was having a hard time believing he didn't deserve everything that had happened to him over the past year and a half. Karma was a bitch, and he was feeling its unabated wrath. In some ways, he was waiting for something like this to happen his entire life. Other than the extreme guilt that plagued his thoughts each day and his dreams every night, he'd never truly paid for his brother's death so many years ago. As if on cue, the shrill horn of a train sounded as it made its approach into the Otisville Metro North train station, located less than a half-mile southwest of the jail. Daniel was a 16-year-old boy again, back home in his family's brownstone in Chicago. It was a Friday night, December 3rd, 1993, his brother Peter's 15th birthday. Earlier in the evening, the family had celebrated by eating dinner at Peter's favorite restaurant, and then held a small party at home just for the immediate family. Peter's big bash was scheduled for the following day. Friends and the rest of the family were invited for a night at the Navy Pier, ice skating and pizza, Peter's two great passions. Later that Friday night, Daniel had plans for a special birthday blowout of his own for his younger brother. At midnight, Daniel lay awake in his bed, fully clothed, wanting to be sure his parents were asleep. Normally, they went to bed early, around 10, and were well into the 5th and final stage of dream sleep by midnight. Delayed by the party, they hadn't gone to their room until 11. Daniel waited patiently the extra hour, though sure they had probably conked out right after their heads hit their pillows. He was up, throwing on a jacket, and on his way to his brother's room before the clock struck 12:01. "Get up, Pete," Daniel whispered as he shook his snoring brother's shoulder, ready with his index finger over his pursed lips to keep Peter from making any loud noises. Peter jumped up to a seated position. Seeing his older brother's indication to stay quiet, he fought his inclination to shout. "What the fuck? What are you doing?" he asked in a half-whisper. "Just get up and get dressed. We're going out." "No way. Get the hell out of here. I'm tired. I'm going back to sleep." "Get your ass up. Don't be a pussy. It's time to really celebrate your birthday." "I ain't going nowhere. Dad finds out, he'll kick our asses." "Dad's not gonna find out. Stop with the fucking goody two-shoes routine. Have some balls. Get up and let's go." The roles between the two brothers were in some ways reversed from what would be expected of a first and second child. Peter was the structured one, mature, well-behaved, the caretaker. Daniel was much more likely to break the rules and challenge authority. They were typical in one respect. Peter idolized and adored his older brother. It took some doing, but Daniel could usually talk him into just about anything. That night was no different. After a few more curses mumbled under his breath, Peter got up and slipped into a pair of jeans and a sweatshirt. It was an atypically mild night for December in Chicago. The temperature was in the mid-50s, and in the part of the city where the Falcones lived, the Windy City, was nothing of the sort. The trees were as still as a leopard, lying in wait to seize its dinner. Before heading downstairs, Daniel grabbed a bag with 2 six-packs of Bud Light from under his bed, and they were on their way, tiptoeing as they descended the steps which led directly to the front door. Daniel checked his pocket to be sure he had his house keys. Then the 2 teenage boys stepped out into the quiet night, well lit by the lights of the city and a full moon directly over their heads. "Where are we going, and what's in the bag?" asked Peter as soon as they'd closed the door behind them. "You'll find out. Let's go." Daniel set out at a brisk pace in the direction of Lake Michigan with Peter at his side. The Falcones lived on the 2nd and 3rd floors of a brownstone built in the early 1950s, about a mile from the lake. On foot, it took them just less than 15 minutes to arrive at Grant Park, a state compound covering 300 acres situated along the waterfront. They made their way directly to one of Chicago's most famous landmarks, the Clarence Buckingham Fountain. Distracted by the dancing, multicolored spotlights reflecting off the surging water, Peter initially failed to notice his best friend, Ross, and Daniel's football teammate, Contrell, waiting for them on the lakeside of the fountain. Daniel's buddy was also carrying a bag with 2 six-packs of beer. Together, the 4 teenagers crossed Lakeshore Boulevard in search of a secluded spot away from any potential unwanted onlookers. Once they were settled on the partition wall overlooking the black expanse of Lake Michigan, Daniel pulled out the first six-pack. "My baby brother didn't want to come out here. Think he's man enough to drink his first beer?" Daniel asked the group. "Fuck you, Daniel, I'm here, ain't I?" replied Peter. "You gonna drink, or are you afraid you might get in trouble with Mommy and Daddy?" Daniel teased. Contrell found Daniel's goading hilarious and laughed louder than the situation warranted. "Shut up, Contrell. Why don't you keep on sniffing Daniel's ass? It's what you do best," quipped Peter. Now it was Daniel who was bent over laughing. Contrell, defensive tackle for the football team, was 6'5" and weighed about 260. He stood up and made a move toward Peter that Daniel quickly quashed by stepping between them. "Knock it off, Contrell. I'm the only one that gets to beat his ass." "So, what's the deal, Pete?" Daniel twisted the cap off a Bud Light and held it out to his brother. Nervous, but not about to have his manhood challenged by the person he admired most in the world, Peter grabbed the beer and chugged several gulps. The other boys showed their approval with some hooting and hollering, breaking open their bottles and attempting to swallow bigger swigs than the rest. Peter's best friend, Ross, was the first to finish his beer. Unlike Peter, Ross didn't keep strictly to the straight and narrow. When Daniel called him 2 nights ago to invite him to the gathering, he'd agreed without hesitation. Ross had been trying to get Peter to party for more than a year. It didn't take an hour for each of the boys to finish their respective 6-packs of beer. Peter was already slurring his speech and having difficulty keeping his balance when he stood. The other boys had more experience and were handling the alcohol a bit better. "We need some more beer," commented Ross. "I have a friend who can get us some," offered Contrell. "He's 21. I can get him to bring it to us, but we'll have to pay him extra." "I'm in." Ross raised his hand high in the air as if making a bid at an auction. "I've got $20. "Me too," said Daniel. "I'll pay for Pete." Contrell walked the 20 yards to the bank of payphones east of the fountain and called his friend, who agreed to get them 2 more 6-packs. After notifying the group of his success, He pulled a small marijuana roach from his jacket pocket and held it up to Peter. "I brought this for the birthday boy. He can probably get 3 or 4 hits from it." "That'll knock him on his ass. It's really good crip." "Man, I don't know about that," Daniel said. Drinking was one thing for Daniel, but drugs were a whole other issue. He already had aspirations to be an FBI agent. Drugs were strictly off-limits. "Come on," Ross replied. "It's his birthday. You're only 15 once. He'll be fine. He's not going to turn into a druggie." "Gimme that thing," Peter slurred. "I'm a man. I make my own decisions." Contrell handed the roach to Peter, who promptly put it in his mouth. As Contrell was lighting it, he instructed, "Inhale real deep and hold it." Before Daniel could stop his brother, Peter sucked in a double-sized dose, then immediately started hacking uncontrollably. Daniel knocked the roach from his mouth and stomped it out, but his response was too late. A considerable amount of the potent kryptonite marijuana penetrated Peter's bloodstream. The drug, in combination with the alcohol, resulted in a high that would have significantly impaired the capacities of a grown man with a strong tolerance for mind-altering substances. "What the fuck, man?" shouted Contrell. "That stuff is expensive. I could have smoked it." "Then you should have. Don't be giving that shit to my brother." Peter mumbled something incomprehensible, then proceeded to vomit up his dinner and birthday cake. Ross and Contrell found it quite funny, but Daniel was not as amused. "Serves you right," he said. Minutes later, Contrell's friend arrived with the beer, and the incident with the marijuana was forgotten. "You sure you can handle more beer, Pete? I'm not cleaning it up later if you puke all over yourself," warned Daniel. "I'm fine, dude. I feel much better." "If you say so. Just don't pass out." "Let's get out of here," said Ross. "I'm sick of looking at the lake." The horn of the Red Line train blasted in the distance, giving Daniel an idea that he would regret for the rest of his life. "Let's go check out the train tracks," he suggested. Near Michigan Avenue, on the west side of the park, a series of bridges crossed over 6 sets of rails running north and south below ground level. From each trestle there was an unobstructed view of downtown Chicago, the train tracks disappearing into the base of the skyscrapers. By the time the teenagers arrived at the first bridge, they had each consumed 2 more bottles of beer, and all had lost their holds on good judgment. It was Daniel's idea to climb down the trestle support to the tracks 20 feet below and follow them into the heart of the city. Daniel was the first to reach the platform, followed by Contrell and then Ross. The 3 managed not to hurt themselves despite their inebriated state. Peter was not as fortunate. The instant he lifted his second leg over the railing of the trestle, he lost his grip. He was in free fall, his body perpendicular to the platform, feet first. To Daniel, it seemed as though it were happening in slow motion. His first instinct was to attempt to catch his brother before he hit the ground. He tried to make a move to the spot he calculated Peter would land, but it felt like his feet were glued to the cement. Looking up, he watched Peter's fall, as if he were reviewing a film, frame by frame, powerless to edit the outcome. Peter reached out for something to grasp with his right arm as his body bent at the waist with his hand outstretched. He clutched his fist, catching nothing but air. Both arms began to flail. He looked down toward the platform and tucked his chin against his upper chest and placed his hands behind his neck in a learned protective maneuver. Due to an instinctive defensive reflex, his legs bent at the knee. His position shifted in midair as he performed a perfect half-somersault in his descent, a tortuous slow turn to first parallel to the earth and then upside down. When Daniel was finally able to respond, it was too late. He launched himself toward Peter without any real plan. The only purpose it served was to give him a close-up view of his brother's impact with the ground. Daniel landed on his stomach, inches from the point where the crown of Peter's skull struck the concrete platform, smashing the brain's only protection into 100 pieces. While fragments of bone lodged into his parietal and frontal lobe, his neck snapped backward, severing the spinal cord at the first vertebrae. Peter was dead before the rest of his body hit the ground. Lying awake in his jail cell, Daniel wondered if he were finally paying for the terrible sins he'd committed back when he was a teenager, and all the subsequent mistakes he'd made as a result. Even his tendency toward overachievement could be traced back to Peter's death. It solidified his choice to pursue a career in law enforcement, driving him to dedicate just about every ounce of his energy to putting bad guys behind bars. Maybe it was a subconscious effort to cleanse his soul. At the end of the day, he knew it wasn't enough. Before everything went wrong, he had taken great strides advancing both his personal and professional lives. Though his marriage was teetering at the edge of a cliff for some time, he and his wife Deborah had made a major breakthrough working toward reconciliation. Unlike his father, she was willing to try to forgive him for his previous transgressions. At the office, he was the best agent by far. His progression through the ranks of the FBI was on an unprecedented fast track. He was the youngest agent in the history of the Bureau to be appointed as a special agent in charge of a field office. For his significant contribution to the resolution of several high-profile crimes, he received national accolades and achieved worldwide notoriety. He established contacts with major players in Washington, D.C., and was described by the director of the Bureau as its golden boy. Just 2 weeks before his arrest, he was invited to the White House to be honored by the President of the United States for his contribution to the war on drugs. All that changed in a horrific twist of fate when he and Deborah decided to accept a gift to sail on the King luxury cruise liner, the Joy of the Seas. The carnage was discovered by Chief Cabin Steward Ko-Chi Kuyang Kang, who was having his usual difficulty sleeping that night. During his ritual early morning walk through his team's assigned territory, he found Daniel covered head to toe in blood, stumbling through the halls of the Lido deck in a zombie-like trance. It was a massacre that made international news and dubbed Daniel the Blood Boat Butcher. Charged with 3 counts of homicide by the very people he had called friends and colleagues, he couldn't deny that all of the physical evidence pointed to him as the killer. Although he was unable to explain his behavior on that infamous morning, even to himself, he was absolutely sure of one thing: he was innocent.